Hi everyone, this is Giacomo with SDL Tones and welcome back to this mini-series dedicated to AmpHub. In this video we'll continue talking about clean guitar sounds together with effects, specifically dry and wet tones. When it comes to clean guitar tones, we rarely imagine it completely dry as guitarists. We usually add some reverb, delay, or even modulation effects like chorus. This is the nature of many clean sounds, and today we're going to delve into this aspect. So the first thing we need to talk about is the placement of the effects, specifically how and where we place them into our chain. So in AmpHub we have two options, before or after the amplifier. We usually place wah, octave or pitch-based effects before the amp because they interact very intensely with the clean guitar signal. So following these elements but still before the amp, we may insert overdrive or distortion pedals. Modulation effects like, for example, flanger, chorus or phaser can be placed either pre or post depending on the type of sound we're aiming for, and we're going to listen the difference in a bit. At this point, let's talk about delay and reverb, which we generally place after the amp, so in post, so they don't affect the core sound but fulfill their role as ambient effects. So this is a pretty basic rule, but remember there's no exact lawful order, so creativity is key here, and there are many examples of theoretically incorrect placements recorded on some historical albums, so don't be afraid to experiment. Let's start from the end of the chain and see what kind of difference it makes to place an effect before or after the amp. So let's stay in mono stereo mode to carefully listen to how the elements of the chain interact with each other and why. Notice how, first of all, in terms of width of the sound, there's a significant difference. When we send an ambient effect into the amp's input, we are practically altering its response because it won't receive a clear signal input with distinct transients, but rather a less direct sound which will inevitably make it react differently. So additionally, amps are mono, so if we use a stereo-capable effect before it, we're gonna lose the stereo width. When placed in post, instead, we have a clearer and more focused direct sound and a nice stereo spread in case of reverb, with the depth of the effect that we choose with the dry-wet mix. In fact, by using the dry-wet mix, we create a small parallel routing within the pedal that preserves the direct signal and enhances the depth of the reverb in this case. An important aspect is to always ask ourselves what function each element in the chain serves. So answering these questions is essential, especially when using multiple pedals and effects to avoid unexpected or bad-sounding results. For example, where do we place the delay? Before or after the reverb, and why? We usually put the delay before the reverb because we want the reverb to be the final touch of our sound, immersing it into a dimension of our choice, large or small, it's up to our choice. But what if we want to create more unique tones, unique ambient sounds, for example? In this case, I like to use reverb first to widen up the stereo space and create a very interesting and emotionally impactful diffuse sound that pushes the sound of our guitar to the boundaries, like a pad or a synth or whatever sounds really big, wide and spread. Let's have a listen. AmpHub is truly capable of covering all musical territories. The only limit is our ability to experiment. Now, let's ask ourselves, when should we use a modulation effect in front of the amp and when after? So the rule I give myself is that when the sound is clean, I am pretty free to choose whether to place it on pre or post. But when the sound starts to get crunchy, modulation placed in front is less effective and more confusing, making the tone less punchy and more muddy, which doesn't really happen so much when the amp is clean. But why? When we place modulation effects in pre, so in front of the amp, we are hitting the preamp, so the gain section, we are hitting the amp's equalizer, so the sound can lose definition, and often this is something we want to avoid. So by putting after the amp, we have a sound that is definitely less compressed, clearer, and we have a greater separation when we are adjusting the dry-wet balance or the dry-wet mix. So I remind you again, in some cases we are maybe not looking for the pure, clearest tone possible, so it's really up to you and up to what we want to do with the sound that we are developing into AmpHub. So depending on the sound, whether it's clean or crunch, our preferences might vary. So let's listen to an example where we hear a chorus before and after the amp. In my opinion, unless there are particularly creative uses, it's not a good idea to overdo with effects, because there's a risk to completely altering the guitar sound, making it unnatural. So the sounds I prefer are the result of a sum of details. Now let me play a sound where I have a pretty rich chain, and you'll hear how using effects with the right amount gives us a defined, detailed result, even if undeniably heavily affected. Now let's hear another example of a sound rich of effects with the addition of pitch modification. So personally, given the role of this type of effect, I set it in the very first block of the chain, so it works on just the pure GI of my instrument. It's essential for me to use effects in the right positions in the chain to get the best out of them, and this is another aspect that I suggest you think about from time to time to reconsider your chain. Most of the times, an effect is not sounding so great because it's not in the best position possible in that specific chain. Let's have a listen. So that's all for this video. Thank you for being with me and STL Tones, and we'll see in the next one.